What was the war like between Norman Osborn and Asgard, and how was Loki behind it all? Loki's schemes and plans have pulled even some of the smartest heroes and villains into his agenda. He has been able to trick some of the most gifted individuals in the Nine Realms to further his own wishes, and in many cases, this has been completely unbeknownst to them. On one occasion, Loki was able to orchestrate an invasion and war with Asgard, using none other than Norman Osborn as a figurehead of the assault. So today, my friends, let's discuss how Loki was able to pull this off, the event in question, and how Norman and the Dark Avengers went to war. To the public's eye, Norman was acting as a hero, leading the likes of Sentry and several other heroes in the Avengers roster. This assembly took place in the aftermath of the superhuman Civil War, when the public had just watched the superhero community tear itself apart, and Norman Osborn, being a prestigious public figure, was able to rise to power. Following this, however, Asgard was relocated to a small town in Oklahoma, and the population of Asgard had laid claim to a certain sector of American land. It was during this time that he asked the President of the United States if Norman could invade Asgard, with Osborn believing that it posed a legitimate threat to national security. The President, however, denied Osborn's claim and refused to support an attack on Asgard. But Loki had overheard this discussion and began to formulate a plan. Later, in casual conversation, the trickster reminded Osborn of how the calamity of the Civil War had started in the first place, with the Stamford incident. In the final days of the peace before the Civil War, a team of C-list heroes known as the New Warriors were in Stamford, Connecticut, filming scenes for their new reality show. During one of these missions, they came into conflict with Nitro, and just when they believed that they had defeated him, he caused a massive explosion near a local elementary school, killing 60 children and 600 total civilians, a popular event in comics. This single terrible act was enough to spur Congress into passing the Superhuman Registration Act, and Loki painted this as an inspiration for Osborn, who was looking for an excuse to start his own war. So the two began to look for opportunities, and found an opening when the Asgardian warrior Volstagg made a trip to Chicago. Once in Chicago, he dips his toe into the superhero life, but he wasn't quite sure how to balance his own strength with that of the mortals that he was surrounded by, and so, while trying to stop a robbery, he caused more collateral damage than a more experienced hero would have. Osborn, however, was puppeteering his own idea, and he assembled a team known as the UFOs. These energy-based villains were being led by the Hood at Osborn's behest, and he tasked them with ambushing Volstagg. The team took the fight to Soldier Field during a sold-out football game, packed to the brim with thousands of fans and hundreds of staff members. Here, two members of the villain team, X-Ray and Vector, bombarded Volstagg with energy beams, and while he was able to resist them, the shockwaves ravaged Soldier Field, killing nearly everyone inside. Osborn and Loki watched in astral forms as the stadium collapsed, knowing full well that Volstagg, and Asgard by proxy, would be held responsible for it by the United States government. And they believed that because of that, the president would greenlight an attack on Asgard. After this was confirmed, Norman returned to his office and began planning the siege, even going so far as to consult Ares on the best way to lay siege to such a massively powerful enemy. Norman assembled the Dark Avengers as well as several members of the Initiative, and made a promise that if the attack is successful, then they are no longer obligated to work for him, and that he will dissolve the Dark Avengers officially. The president, however, has never formally approved of this operation, and is actively trying to reach Norman in order to call it off. But by this point, Norman Osborn is too far gone. Loki, however, in order to stir the pot, returns to Asgard and warns Balder of Osborn's impending attack, so that Balder may scramble Asgard's forces in preparation. The first wave was only the Sentry, who arrived and used his massive powers to burn through the first lines of Asgard's defenses. Second, Norman, armed with the Iron Patriot armor, led an aerial assault. When Thor finally arrived, he is first met by the Sentry, and the two battle one another fiercely, with the God of Thunder eventually throwing the Sentry aside in order to focus on the Iron Patriot Norman. But Sentry's attacks had exhausted and weakened the god, and after this, Norman was able to make quick work of the son of Odin. The siege quickly makes international news, with claims of Thor's defeat reaching all corners of the globe as Asgard begins to strain under the weight of an impending invasion. In Chicago, however, journalist Ben Urich is able to tell that something isn't quite right with the situation, and is nearly arrested for trying to enter Soldier Field. After getting out of this, however, he is able to track down Volstagg, who is preparing himself to surrender to Asgardian forces. But Ben is quickly able to ascertain that the media is being manipulated. Norman has stacked multiple media outposts to cover the invasion of Asgard through his own lens. As the siege continues though, multiple heroes, villains, and Avengers are brought into the fray, including the likes of Buckley, Captain America, Spider-Man, and Spider-Woman. In the streets, the battle between Baldur and Ares shatters every landmark in sight as the two gods clash. But when Heimdall steps in, he reveals to Ares that he's been lied to by Norman. On the other end of the battlefield, Osborne approaches a battered and beaten Thor, proclaiming him to be under arrest and asserting that Asgard was now under Norman Osborn's jurisdiction. One by one, the forces of Asgard fell to the power of the Dark Avengers, and it was only by distraction that Thor was able to escape. Maria Hill attacked Norman with a rocket launcher, and in the hunt for Hill's head, Thor was able to escape Norman's wrath. Osborne, however, has created a new enemy in Ares, who vows to end Norman's life at all costs due to his deception. The only one standing in his way was the Sentry, and the fight between the two culminated not only with much more collateral damage, but with the Sentry quite literally ripping Ares into two. In Brooklyn, Steve Rogers rallies the forces, uniting the New Avengers, the Young Avengers, and the Secret Warriors into one unit that will serve as Asgard's enforcement. In the outskirts of Braxton though, Ben Urich and Volstagg are making their way closer and closer to Asgard, but are intercepted by Hammer agents. After fighting off the agents, Volstagg has a run-in with the local sheriff, whom he manages to convince of his innocence, and with Ben's help, he is able to broadcast his message across the world. They attempt to set the record straight about Norman's plan and begin to cast doubt on his legitimacy as a hero, and the president then decides to mobilize the United States military to bring Norman and the Dark Avengers into custody under the charge of treason. When Captain America and the Avengers arrived, they take immediate steps towards regaining control of the streets. It is with Steve's leadership that the otherwise disjointed heroes unite into a single force, with Thor now beginning to recover. With Tony's help, the Avengers are able to shut down Osborne's armor while Thor goes to set the record straight with the Sentry. In a duel for the ages, Thor puts everything he has into crippling the Sentry, all of his power, only to find that it is all little effect on the Sentry and his own abilities. Rather than allowing the Avengers to have Asgard, however, Osborne orders the Sentry to destroy everything. If Norman could not have it, then nobody could, and the Sentry follows that order. The Sentry eradicates New Asgard on a foundational level before the horrified eyes of both sides, and in doing so, he gives himself over to the unprecedented power of the Void. Amidst the wreckage, Captain America finds Norman and places him under arrest, only to find that beneath the Iron Patriot armor is the deranged face of the Green Goblin, the Goblin who has been believed to have been dead up until this point. What's interesting about this though, is that the heroes are only able to confront the Void due to Loki's regret. He begins to see the calamity has gone too far and defected to the Avengers in the final moments of the war. With the power of Odin's spear and the Norn stones, Loki was able to empower Captain America's forces, and even Thor himself to combat the Void. The Void sees this, however, and attacks Loki for his treachery, ripping him apart and leaving him to die in his brother's arms. With his final breath, he asks Thor to avenge him, which sends Thor into an enraged fury against the Void. And by crashing the Hammer helicarrier into the very beast itself, he was able to revert the Sentry back to Robert Reynolds, who then begs Thor to end his life there. Thor, though, refuses, but when the Void begins to resurface, he realizes that he has no choice. He ends Reynolds' life, and in the aftermath, wraps him in a cape and sends him drifting into the sun. The rest of the story follows the Avengers as they track down the Dark Avengers, and this was the final nail in the coffin of the Superhuman Registration Act. It also displays the idea that Loki, while normally treacherous and conniving, does eventually find redemption in many stories. He is capable of compassion and regret, and when it comes down to it, he is able to make the right decision in order to fight for the forces of good. But anyway, my friends, what do you think of the story of the Siege of Asgard? Do you think any variants of Loki will orchestrate wars in the MCU moving forward? And do you think he's capable of creating massive conflicts like this one if Loki ever desired? Now that the mainline Loki has become god of stories, will we see other variants of him be more mischievous and even dangerous somewhere in the multiverse? Thank you as always so much for visiting the channel today, my friends. Hit that subscribe button to assemble and join our team, and have a great one.